So you can think of the physical world, sustainability, climate, earth, water, air, the world of atoms. And then you've got the virtual world of technology and AI, the world of bits, if you will. And then the third sphere is society, the social world, genes, if you will, atoms, bits, and genes. And the social world is society, humanity, governance, law, privacy, security, trust, all the sort of human institutions, and other species as well. And so if you think of these three spheres, if you will, they're interconnected, each one to and from. So we connect to our environment, the environment around us. We in the physical sense, literally, we have the human right to the access of food, clean water, and air from the environment, and we give our waste products back to the environment. So sanitation and the human right to access to sanitation is part of it. So this to from the environment is like this bi-directional path. We draw from the environment and give to it. And likewise, we sense the environment around us and we respond to it. So a technology should not prevent us from seeing and understanding the environment around us. So these kind of VR headsets in your living room or something is cutting you off from the natural world. And when we turn our back on nature, it's sort of bad for the environment and that sort of thing. So I've always felt that instead of us having to wrap ourselves like a pretzel around the technology should wrap itself around us and actually connect us more with our environment rather than disconnect us from it. And so there's this interplay, two-way street between us and the world around us. And likewise, there's HCI is a feedback loop between us and technology, the two-way street between us and technology. And of course, the technology itself has that two-way street to the environment. The technology senses the environment and affects the environment. And so these 6 connections are sort of fundamental to this idea of what we call mersivity or humanistic intelligence or the sustainable technology society or whatever, if you will. And a lot of the work that you do, I think, is important because it speaks to kind of the corporatization of our relationship with technology.
Okay. I'm all of that sounds good. Is there a question in there, or are you seeking my reflections on it, or?
Yeah, I guess I like the idea of playing a little jazz.
Okay. Well, I have often thought when we talk about instruments in our city and privacy, that the category error that we make is in thinking of people as things to be sensed rather than as sensors or actuators. That, there's absolutely nothing wrong with me having telemetry that says, hey, the next bus is really full. Why don't you take a southbound bus and take the subway? And to have that sensed of the bus is very useful. But there's something foundationally different about telemetry from me being fed into the transit system continuously. So even if that is used to add more buses to the route, knowing that I personally am going from place to place and knowing about my journeys is literally dehumanizing, right? It's treating me as a thing to be sensed rather than as a sensor and actuator. And
yeah, that's the idea of productization or commercialization of human commodity. Like what we're really talking about is surveillance versus surveillance. When you're being sensed, that's surveillance, and when you're doing the sensing, that's surveillance.
I'm thinking about it not just in terms of power relationships, but also in terms of how to deliver utility and how to frame utility delivering services so that they are so that they're harder to go, it's harder for them to go wrong. You know, if we obviously there's this point at which sensing a bus and how crowded it is foundationally sensing the people on the bus, but it's the difference between saying here's a fact about the bus and here's a fact about the people on the bus. You know, it's one thing to say, okay, well, every day this stretch of road sees so many cars and so many bicycles and so many pedestrians, and to say, when I follow people around rather than monitoring the road, but when I monitor people, I discover that they take these car journeys, these bus journeys, and these journeys on foot. And then I infer things about this stretch of road from it. And I think about the people who build these systems and services and operate them. Sometimes they're firms, sometimes they're public entities, and sometimes they're blended. They're firms working for public entities and so on. And irrespective of how they're organized, there are people within these institutions for whom the benefits matter, right? The reason they get up to work every morning is to make the world better. And there are other people who have other goals, profit maximization or cutting costs or something else that might be antithetical to the interests of the users. Now, the person who's getting up every morning to do it in the interests of the users might be wrong, right? They might make choices that are wrong and are harmful to users or to the public, but not because they disregard the public's well-being, but because they made a mistake. And there's a different kind of accountability that you use to address people who are wrong versus people who are malicious. And let's set aside people who are wrong for now and talk about how we make an institution so that the people who aren't malicious win the arguments against the people who view the users of the system and the public more broadly as things rather than as people, as a means to an end. You know, there's the Immanuel Kant talks about this as the categorical imperative that, you know, treating people as a means to an end instead of as ends unto themselves is wicked. There's a formulation of this in one of the Terry Pratchett novels where Granny Weatherwax says all sin begins with treating people as things. Every other form of sin is just a variation on that. And so how do you help the people who don't view other people as things win the arguments against the people who, for whatever reason, view people as things? And part of that is in the capacity of the system itself. If the system only knows about things and not people, right? It knows about buses but not riders. It knows about sidewalks but not pedestrians. Then it is much harder to thingify the people who are using it because you can't directly sense them. You can only sense you can only infer them by their actions, by the stuff that happens.
That's an interesting concept of thingify somebody.
Yeah.
In other words, when we think of the physical world of atoms, physical objects, versus the technology world of bits and the social world of genes, the error comes in conflating the social human world with the physical. That is to say that, let's say that breakdown between environment and environment. The environment is that which is around you, and the environment is you yourself. And we normally think of this separation between our environment and our environment. And the surveillance system, the more that it gets to see you, the more that the environment is the boundary between the environment and the environment, like the bus. And the more that the bus has a surveillance system in it that serves the interests of the authorities as well as the bus owners, let's say the combined effort of governments and corporations, which are getting more and more blurred. I can't tell the difference between governments and corporations. The two of them have become so blurred that we've just got this surveillance structure that none of us can understand that has us all under surveillance.
Yeah, you said there a surveillance system that serves the bus's owners and not the corporate owners or the systems owners and not the users of the system. I guess the point that I'm making is that if it doesn't matter if you set out to make a surveillance system that serves the users of the system or its owners, that to the extent that it can be co-opted, you should anticipate that it will be. That like designing the capability for it, this is the gun on the mantelpiece, right? When you put the capability for surveillance or co-option into the system, you add a burden to the people of goodwill within the system who are trying to defend its integrity, because in addition to having to defend against people who want to alter the system or add new functionality to the system that might be antithetical to its users' interests, they also have to defend against the misuse of existing facilities. So we have a lot of systems that are designed to override their owners' interests, sometimes in with the best of intention, right? Your iPhone won't install third-party software, only software delivered by the App Store. And the story from Apple, which is not entirely false, but nor is it entirely true, is that they use this power to make sure that you don't accidentally install malicious software. But the existence of a facility for preventing you from choosing which software to install means that eventually something is going to happen that's bad. And in the case of Apple, there have been a bunch of these. One is that the Chinese government said to Apple, all right, remove all the working VPNs because we want to be able to figure out who we should stick in a gulag. And by having the facility in the operating system, Apple basically invited the Chinese state to show up and demand the use of that facility in ways that were antithetical to Apple's users. And Apple will say, well, look, this wasn't our call, right? The Chinese state made us do it. But if the Chinese state had to say, first, modify the iPhone so it only runs software that has been blessed by Apple, and then withdraw your blessing from VPNs, that's a much longer road they have to go down in order to harm Chinese Apple users or Apple customers than
so in other words,
saying use this facility. The
surveillance is built into Apple. Like Apple talks a lot about privacy, but really Apple is the opposite of privacy. It depends on how you define privacy, but if privacy means like the panopticon is a jail where the prisoners can't see each other, but they're all visible from the central guard tower. A lot of people would say that matches the definition of modern privacy, that your neighbors can't see you, but the police can still see you. You see all these surveillance cameras and they say, oh, we've encrypted it so that only the authorities can see it. So it guarantees your privacy.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that this is about surveillance being built in, but rather that Apple's privacy guarantees work well but fail badly. So to the extent that Apple is benevolent and competent.
Well, how do we know? How do we know that? Like,
right. So there are limits to it. So I think that we can say, hey, Apple, let's stipulate, at least for the sake of argument, that people at Apple want to defend my privacy. How do we help them do that? Right? How do we make sure that the people inside of Apple, because there's another Apple story here, which is that within months of Apple kicking Facebook surveillance out of the App Store by turning off app tracking, they activated their own covert program of tracking on the iPhone for the same purpose, right? They use it for targeting ads. They have a competing targeted ad network. And you can't turn it off because of the way that the iPhone is architected. If you reverse engineer the iPhone to change the way it's configured, you fall afoul of anti-circumvention law. In Canada, that's Bill C-12. In America, it's Section 12.1 of the DMCA, and so on. And so if we think of Apple as a site of contestation among people who want to spy on Apple users if it makes Apple more money, and people who think that's a bad idea, I think that's a fair representation of Apple. There are people at all ranks within the firm who fall into one camp or the other. How do we the way that you guarantee that the good guys lose is by making it easy for the bad guys to win, right? If there is this facility built into iOS, if there is a law that backstops it, that prohibits removing that facility, then you are absolutely have this foreseeable outcome of Apple spying on its users.
Yeah, yeah. So it should be foreseeable. Like there's two kinds of elements. One is an insider job where you got to trust Apple and they could be bad inside. The other is that it facilitates bad actors outside. So either way, building a surveillance superhighway or whatever you want to call it, building surveillance and its counterparts of control, centralized control into the technology, makes it into a surveillance technology primarily. We have what we call surveillance technologies, which are technologies that are inherently designed to give control to the end users.
Mm-hmm. So I still don't think that this is about surveillance. I think surveillance is downstream from the lack of corporate discipline, of discipline on corporations or institutions that would cause them to avoid all kinds of conduct that is antithetical to the public interest, not just surveillance, because there's other ways you can hurt people besides with surveillance.
But where does that discipline come from?
So there's four sources of corporate discipline, at least in the digital world. I think there's fewer in the offline world, in the non-digital world, because there are some unique digital capacities. So one is competition, another is regulation, a third is the workforce, and a fourth is self-help measures on the part of users. And these are all interrelated. So firms that don't face competition find it much easier to capture their regulators. If you think back to the Napster era, when there were a couple of hundred tech companies and 7 entertainment companies, even though the 7 entertainment companies were an order of magnitude smaller in aggregate than the tech companies, they kicked their asses. And it was because every time they showed up in Parliament or Congress or in a court or in front of a regulator, they all said the same thing. Whereas tech didn't agree because they were fragmented. And so the competition prevented the regulatory capture. Today, tech is far more concentrated than entertainment was back then. I often say it's got a Habsburg jaw, and it speaks with a very unified voice in all regulatory and legal forums. And so the lack of competition means that they don't worry about you going somewhere else, but it also means that they don't worry about getting their asses kicked by regulators because they have sought control, achieve control over the regulators. It also means that they don't really have to worry about their workforce because there are fewer and fewer places to work in tech, and they have a tighter and tighter set of employment policies. And it's not a coincidence the tech industry is very anti-union. They want to be able to fire workers who say it will be a moral injury to me if you take this product that I worked on and care about and whose users I feel a sense of duty to and do something bad with it. At this point, they can just say, okay, well, you're fired, right? Because unionization levels are so low. And also because now we've trained lots of people who can do tech jobs. And so there's precarity there. And finally, the self-help measures that users traditionally availed themselves of, right? Ad blockers and third-party clients and whatever, those have become increasingly fraught also because of the regulatory capture, because we have managed to make it illegal to do the reverse engineering, to bypass the terms of service,
Why is it illegal to understand something? Why is science, in a sense, illegal?
This is an important question. I asked this question of Tony Clement and of James Moore when they were bringing Bill C-12 in, and I asked it of Sam Bolte, their liberal opponent, when she was trying to bring in the same bill. It was a very bipartisan consensus. And I think the argument is what Jay Freeman calls it. It's felony contempt of business model. The argument is that the necessity of preserving a business model, even if it means reaching beyond the walls of the firm and exerting control over customers or critics or competitors, is more important in this moment of corporate capture of the state than the autonomy and dignity and self-determination of the public and the ability of competitors to thrive, which is ironic when you think that all of the largest firms are in this part of the world are American, and their competitors are Canadian, and you have the Canadian state carrying water for American firms to prevent Canadian firms from competing.
Yeah, so there's this conflation between what we call governments, corporate governments, and corporations, which are government corporations. And the boundaries are so blurred that, in a sense, they're all working together against the end user. It's sort of, in some sense, you could think of it, if the political spectrum between the left and right is kind of blurred or wrapped around, it's really the bigs, if you will, versus the individuals. It no longer makes sense to talk about left versus right politically, or government versus corporation. It's also blurred out that the only thing that we can really talk about is the bigs versus the individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, I mean, I think we are always going to have institutions to facilitate large scale action. It's inevitable. The internet does lower the coordination costs of collaborating to do big ambitious things. We definitely can build encyclopedias and operating systems and ways that we used to organize like really ambitious bake sales, and that's really cool. But there's always going to be things that are ambitious and at a scale that will require a degree of coordination that is going to be hard to manage without institutions. Deb Chakra, the Canadian material scientist, she has a new book out called How Infrastructure Works. And she drops this amazing nugget in it that if you wanted to give every person in the world the energy budget of a Canadian, which is like an American energy budget, but colder, so even larger, all you would need to capture is 0.4% of the solar radiation that strikes the Earth's surface. Right now, to do that, we're going to have to really closely manage our materials to build the apparatus to capture, distribute, and store that energy. But once we do that, the latitude that we get, the degrees of freedom we get from having extremely abundant energy everywhere in the world is amazing, right? So we're going to have to build these institutions. So we need to attend not just to how do we abolish institutions where we can, although that's important. If something can be done without an institution, there's no glory in just building an institution to do it when you don't need a committee to figure out what kind of coffee you're going to have this morning. You do need a committee for other stuff. So as much institutions as we need and no more, but then we need to figure out how do we make institutions that are accountable and that fail gracefully. And I think this is this kind of institution building. If there's anything good that came out of the cryptocurrency bubble, it's that at the margins, there were a bunch of people in the DAO world thinking about how you build robust, accountable institutions that fail gracefully. Now, they failed repeatedly, but stuff with quadratic voting and all these different systems for figuring out how to coordinate large groups of people to do stuff, delegate trust to third parties, but make sure that they're acting trustworthy, embed an ethical core into a project. Benjamin Mako Hill gave a wonderful speech in, I think, 2018 at the Libre Planet conference about how the distinction between open source and free software really mattered, that open source by denaturing free software, not just of the ambiguity of the word free, which we can argue whether that's good or bad, and whether you want to deliberately confuse people and whether that's a good way to build a movement, but like the freedom of free, the ethical consideration of free being removed from open source meant that you could make a series of incremental changes to the practice of open source that never fell afoul of the ethic of keeping your source open, but which repeatedly failed to keep your software free, until you get to this moment now where you have free software in the silos of the big tech companies. So Google has absolute software freedom. They have access to the source of all the tools that they use, and they can reconfigure them to their heart's content. But people who develop applications that that loop through the Google Cloud only have open source. They can look at the source code that for Google's backend, they can even, check in modifications for it into the Git servers for those projects, but they can't make Google change the configuration. And if Google configures things in ways that are antithetical to their freedom, they have no recourse, right? So we have open source for us and freedom for them.
Yeah. It's really, well, I guess the word free has the two meanings, libre and gratuit, in the French Canadian tradition. But the need for free, I think, is really important. The word software has always bothered me, though, because aware is an article or good of commerce. And when I was growing up, we just called it computer programs, and now we call it code. But when you call it software, it kind of commodifies it. It's somebody hawking their wares. And the idea that it's something for sale, it takes a computer program and turns it into merchandise. And so not only free isn't free speech, but
is there a little retconning there? Because I feel like the term software predates the commercial software market. Weren't we distinguishing between software and hardware? Doesn't this come from hardware? Doesn't this come from like programmable systems?
Hardware is also an article of commerce. You go to the hardware store,
it has that origin, right? But
when I was growing up, you'd go to the hardware store and buy a pound of nails.
Yeah, sure. But I just don't know that the etymology is there. I mean, I think that we called it hardware 1953.
Software, 1953.
Software coined in 1953, yeah. And in contrast to hardware.
Hardware's been around for hundreds of years, since the 1100s or something.
Right. And hardware, hardware has a whole bunch of meanings.
The term just kind of irks me a little bit. Like,
I hear you. I think that it's, I don't know. I feel like, so we have, fixture, equipment, tools, and devices used for general purpose construction or repair of a structure or object, right? Also such equipment as sold as stock. But
it's the operative word is sold, and not all computer programs are necessarily for sale.
But the conjunction was or, not and, right? So it's the nails, that if you're a pioneer burning down your house to recover the steel nails, you're still calling them hardware, even though no one ever sold them to you. You made them in the farm forge, right?
But that's not the first word that I would come up with.
Fair, but I think that you're that there's a little revisionism there. That the reason we call it software is not because it's for sale. The reason we call it software is because it's in contrast to hardware. A bit like beta. Beta testing doesn't come from alpha beta. That was a retcon. Beta was better than nothing, and then it was a joke, right? So they were like, oh, it's the beta. It's better than nothing. And we don't want to get too lost in the taking the joke too seriously. I mean, maybe
my concern is largely the commodification of everything.
Sure, I agree.
Like it used to be that you could go for a walk in the park or whatever, but now everything is owned. These private companies want to buy up all our public space. Yeah. Everything is turned into a transaction. So it's these hawking of their wares. Everything is aware now.
I agree.
Firmware.
And that was the grotesque thing about the cryptocurrency bubble, was this Web3 idea that we could solve all the internet's problems by putting price tags on them. And, the apotheosis of this is, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product, which is categorically untrue. I mean, John Deere and its right to repair racket is not driven by the fact that it's giving away free ad-supported tractors, right? The farmer who spends $300,000, $600,000 on a tractor is the product not because they failed to give John Deere enough to buy their loyalty, but because John Deere does not face the discipline of competition, regulation, self-help measures, or a workforce that would rise up against it. And as a consequence, the worst elements within that institution, which has in its history been a good institution, the John Deere company in its early years had a collaborative environment with its customers. There were field engineers who would travel to farms to look at the modifications farmers had made and incorporate them into future models. It's kind of the antithesis of the way that they operate today. What's happened is that the external circumstances have changed such that the very worst impulses of the very worst people in John Deere are the ones that win all contests. And that's how we get the John Deere we have today, not because worse people are running it, and not because it's the season of it, but rather because specific policies predictably give rise to it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stories there. I was talking to Paul Roberts and Louis Rossman and Kevin Kenny, about these big agriculture and the influence that it's having.
Yeah. So we are now at the half-hour mark. I am getting to the point where I probably need to go. I'm getting a stream of messages here from my next call. I'm sorry it can't be longer.
All right. Well, it's certainly fun to connect, and I've wanted to connect with you for some years.
Yeah, likewise.
And this Mersivity Symposium, I guess, has given me cause to reach out to different people on the Sustainable Technology Society and all these ideas of the physical, virtual, and social.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I hit the wrong. Anyways, I apologize. That was my fat finger.
Okay, well, it's been a real honor connecting with you.
Well, thank you. Likewise. I appreciate it, Steve. I do have to run, but best of luck with the event.
Yes, we'll have lots of fun, and we'll keep you up to date. We'll wrap up the proceedings. I'll loop you in as we write up the proceedings, because we're going to write this all up. And
excellent. Okay, I'll talk to you later.
Good. Talk soon.